Our next speaker worked at Microsoft for 13 years, where he led early versions of Outlook, and that might not make him any friends in this audience, IE, or Internet Explorer, and most recently helped start the Bing team and led efforts there on search quality and machine learning until last year. He's the author of the 2005 book More Than Human, Embracing the Promise of Biological Enhancement. He's the winner of the H.G. Wells Award, and he has been to Burning Man 10 times. So please welcome Ramez Naam to the stage.
Thank you very much. Yes. Awesome. Thank you. Hi there, I'm Ramez Naam. I'm not available for your tech support questions, but I will give you advice on getting to Burning Man. I'm an optimist. I've mostly written about human enhancement, but today I'm going to talk about kind of wider scale. I'm going to talk about the Earth and human civilization and some of the issues that face us there. I'm going to do the brave thing, I think, of at a singularitarian conference, talk about problems that exist and challenges that face us. And I am optimistic, so I believe these are all surmountable, but I think it's naive for us to pretend that they don't exist. So the subtitle of this talk is Re-engineering the Ecosystem to Survive and Thrive in the 21st Century. And to keep things fun and light, at a few points, I'll ask you if you can name what picture I'm showing on the slides, and if you can, I'll give you a copy of my book. Okay, so welcome to the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the geological age that is signified by humankind's control over, or at least a massive change of, the biosphere. The Anthropocene, in my view, started about 10,000 years ago. Maybe you think it started 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But we have evidence now that early farming actually affected climate as far back as about 10,000 years ago by changing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and probably helping to stave off another ice age, actually. What we're going to talk about is really the convergence of three things. So global risks, global resources, which are actually quite abundant, and bioscience innovation. Now, I'm not going to make the claim that bioscience is the only sort of innovation that matters in terms of addressing these environmental and resource risks, but it's a very major one. So what are some of the problems and risks? I think you're all familiar with this one, global warming. The planet is warming. It's undoubtedly warmed in the last 50 or 60 years, and it's now fairly incontrovertible that it's anthropic activity that has caused this. Here's a graph of temperatures over the last 150 years or so. Those lines are slopes of different time periods. So you see that the slope over the last 150 years is shallower than the slope over the last 25 years. So we have accelerating change in climate. It's not just the planet's getting warmer, the planet is getting warmer faster as we pump more CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This, we'll come back to that. We can take your questions at the end. This is the IPCC's projections for the future, a range of scenarios. The median scenario is about 3 degrees Celsius of warming over this century, 6 degrees Fahrenheit. The business as usual scenario goes up to about 6 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, I think it's important when talking about global warming to acknowledge that 3 degrees of warming or even 6 degrees of warming will not end the world and will not end human civilization. It's very serious. It could have serious implications for amount of food that we can grow, for human health. 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise at 3 degrees of warming, maybe 3 to 4 meters of sea level rise, 12 feet at 6 degrees of warming in business as usual. Those things are very, very serious. They affect hundreds of millions or billions of people, but they probably would not end human civilization. They probably wouldn't take us to this state here. Okay, first book giveaway. Okay, okay, some of you are going to get booked. Come find me afterwards. That was too easy. All right. So linear climate change is not going to lead to hundreds of feet of sea level rise and the end of the world or the apes taking over in any way. But we have reason to be concerned nonetheless. Because if we zoom out a little bit, this is the last 500,000 years, we have taken the planet, we've taken the CO2 in the atmosphere sort of outside of the recently explored range. CO2 has been this high, but not for tens of millions of years. So in terms of what we can actually study, we're outside of what we're familiar with. We sort of voided the warranty, if you will, on the atmosphere at this point. And you can see the temperature and CO2 do track closely, and so that sharp rise in CO2 with very little end in sight is something that we should be alarmed about. In fact, projection for the end of this century would put CO2 somewhere just a little bit north of the ceiling here right now. The real risk here is not just linear warming, which is bad enough, but the possibility of runaway warming caused by positive feedback cycles. These positive feedback cycles exist. One example is this one. Temperature thaws permafrost. The permafrost has a slowly decaying plant matter in it that contains a lot of CO2 and, more importantly, methane. And then that methane and CO2 is released into the atmosphere, where it causes more warming. So there is the possibility of sort of very local, if you will, singularities of warming. Actually, I won't use that word. There's a possibility of feedback loops that rapidly accelerate things. And in fact, methane is many times more powerful a greenhouse agent than CO2, and we have the potential to release a lot of it. This is a view of where the carbon is in the Earth's system. There's about 750 petagrams of carbon in the atmosphere right now. There's 2,000 petagrams in the plants and soils, much of it in tundra, peat bogs, etc., as well as large forests. There's 40,000 petagrams of carbon in the deep ocean, a lot of it in methane clathrates that are sort of sludgy, half-frozen crystal and mud lattices. You might have seen some of this come up during the recent oil spill. That was one of the things that blocked one of the early attempts to plug it. And much of this is methane. And so the potential warming effect of the release of all of this dwarfs the warming effect of the atmosphere today. So we don't want that to happen. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we don't really have very good models for it, to be honest. But we are increasing the risk of release of this into the atmosphere. And if that were to happen, we would have dramatic warming. How dramatic? Well, another reason to be worried is that things like this appear to have happened in the past. At the end of the Younger Dryas, about 13,000 years ago, temperatures soared by about 15 degrees Celsius, 30 degrees Fahrenheit, in the span of a few decades. So a very, very, very rapid climate change has happened on the Earth before. There's no guarantee that it's about to happen. There is no guarantee that it's about to go into one of these rapid feedback loops, if you will. But there's no guarantee that you'll have a heart attack or get hit by a car in the next year either. We buy insurance for these sorts of things. And if anything remotely like this happened, you would see a situation where the ice on the planet would start to disappear at a noticeable rate, and where you would have oceans rising and flooding of coastal cities and all of those bad science fiction scenarios. And if you think that the singularity cannot be derailed, this is the sort of thing that would seriously dampen economic productivity and innovation, as resources would be shifted towards addressing kind of more basic issues. In fact, William Calvin, who's a wonderful neuroscientist and has written some great books, makes an excellent point that in times of scarcity, violence between societies increases as people fight over scarce resources, and that itself is very destructive. We like the world in a very constructive manner, where interchange between societies is made a matter of innovation and new technology, not where we're just blowing each other up. And this is the sort of thing that increases the odds of that. So, a risk. Even if the temperature doesn't kill us, there are other things going on. So the CO2 that we release into the atmosphere is finding its way into the oceans, where it gets dissolved, creates bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions, which lower the pH of the ocean. When that happens, you have problems, because the calcareous plankton that are at the base of the food chains and the corals that account for about half of the biodiversity in the oceans start having problems creating new shells when there is a high amount of CO2 dissolved in the ocean. They can't calcify as well, so their growth becomes stunted and the oceans become far less productive. This is sort of a little bit of an artistic license on what that looks like. Right now, at 375 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, corals are still there. At about 2 degrees Celsius of warming is when marine scientists believe that corals start to die off in a big way. And at 3 degrees, end of the century, you're looking at potentially no corals on the planet. This is surmountable. We'll get back to it, but it's something to be taken seriously. There's a saying that there's plenty of fish in the sea. Well, that may or may not hold indefinitely. It may or may not be true anymore, even. A fish catch has soared over the recent decades. This is fish catch in millions of tons. But it's starting to level off. It's not clear that it's still going up. And more alarmingly than that, actually, leveling off is not that big a deal, but the amount of effort that goes into catching fish per fish catch is increasing dramatically. So this is kind of the return on investment, if you will. It's gone about 100 times more difficult to bring in fish tonnage than it was several decades ago. This is data from the British fishing fleet. There's also great data from the Japanese fishing fleet, which is the largest on the planet. Their boats are traveling 10 times as far as they used to, and they're bringing back 10 times fewer fish per hook than they used to. So we are definitely putting at risk a lot of large ocean fish. We're dropping their numbers to the point that they just aren't providing enough of the food that we want. Fresh water, I think this is actually the most pressing environmental challenge on the planet and seldom talked about. We all take it for granted here. Fresh water is vital to our food supply as well. It's an integral part of growing our food. Who can name this? This is a two-book one. Aral Sea. Okay, who said that first? Over here someplace. Well, come find me. So this is the Aral Sea in 1989. Here's what it looks like from space in 2003. It used to look even better than this, actually. Here's what it looks like in 2009. You can see the old boundaries. If you actually go down there, you'll see that there are fishing villages with boats sitting on sand, effectively. Now, this was not a factor of global warming. What happened is the Russians took the rivers that used to feed into this and redirected them for irrigation to grow their food supply. And so this sea, which is not in Russia, but borders Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, has basically been drained by a different country. So there's some challenges there. Now, of course, this is someplace in Central Asia. It couldn't affect us. This is the Olagala Reservoir, or aquifer, that sits underneath a large part of the Midwest. And this color coding shows where water levels are dropping. This is over a 15-year period. Red is a drop of more than 40 feet of level in the aquifer, so about 3 feet per year. The aquifer has dropped in those areas. About 2 feet per year in the orange, 1 foot per year in the yellow. Imagine, if you've ever lived near a lake, watching it drop that fast and not be restored. And the restoration times for an aquifer like this are in centuries or millennia, not in years. Food growth. Food has been an enormously positive story. Food yields on this planet are 10 times what they were in antiquity. Since 1960, the Green Revolution has doubled food yields per unit of land. But some of that's starting to be at issue. In 2008, for the first time in decades, we had actual spikes in food prices. Those of us here in the West didn't really notice that much. The developing world did. Now, a lot of this was competition with biofuels, using up the same land. Some of this may have been speculation as well, but there were real issues. This is the Chinese rice yield towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of this century. You see it leveling. This is not total. This is per hectare. So for the first time, after about 40 or 50 years of rapid progress, we may be facing some issues in the food source keeping up with population growth and with demand. Endangered species, I view these, as a computer scientist, I view each of these as a source of information, and I think information loss is a terrible, terrible thing. I hate data loss. And here you see kind of the rate of extinction of species per 1,000 years. And we're at about here now. So we're tracking for 2 orders of magnitude, 3 orders of magnitude faster in species loss than in the fossil record. And we're on track for far greater rates of loss. This is on a log scale. Ray Kurzweil would be very, very glad. But not all things on log scales are good, as it turns out. And if you put it back on a linear scale, it's a hockey stick. It's a quote-unquote singularity of species loss. Peak oil. There have been a finite number of dinosaurs who've walked the Earth and a finite number of plants over the period of the Earth's existence that have been converted into these fossil fuels. And eventually, they will run out. There are various estimates of when that might be. Certainly, we're constantly innovating in ways to get at reserves that we haven't gotten to yet and ways to get them out more cheaply, but there will be a peak. You see, maybe it'll be much higher than it is today, nearly twice as high in the middle of the century. Maybe it's happening right now, is what some people would say. And if we see this 2x multiple between supply and demand, supply down here, demand up there, you can bet the price will be exorbitant. But, as someone said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. So if we look at just the recent past, over the last 5 years, world oil supply has moved within about a 4% band. Actually, it looked for a little while like we'd had a peak in late 06, but we did actually get a little bit better. But it's not growing like it has over most of the last few decades. So there are some potential issues. This is just oil. The situation with coal is much better. The situation with methane is much better. But those are also finite as well. OK, 3 books, if you can name this. HIV, close. It is a virus. This is the SARS virus. Michael Vassar asked me recently to talk about the issue of pathogens. And SARS kind of came out of nowhere and spread to the world. SARS didn't actually kill very many people at all. So to a certain extent, it wasn't that big a deal. But it was frightening because a pathogen that we didn't know about suddenly appeared and within months was everywhere in the world. Those white spots are probably just not reporting that they had SARS there. But certainly, any place you could travel to on an airplane had SARS. And we don't like surprises when it comes to pathogens. That's not what we want to see. It definitely affected culture. You see, SARS mom and child, adorable SARS wedding. It's Chairman Mao back there watching. It must be in Tiananmen Square. SARSmodels.com. So you notice the mask and the handbag match. I'm sure that's what you're looking at. SARS is not the only pathogen that has kind of taken us by surprise. MRSA, methicillin-resistant staph, kind of came out of nowhere. It's killed a lot more people than SARS. It's still not that big a deal, but it has a trajectory that we don't like. And we don't like the idea that pathogens can evolve to be resistant to our tools against them and do so very rapidly and spread in the places that we're supposed to be healing people. A new one is NDM1. NDM1 is an enzyme that in any bacteria that it's present in conveys not just antibiotic resistance, but resistance to our antibiotics of last resort, which previously there was no resistance against. We've been fearing this moment for a while, and it appears to have happened in the last few months. Because bacteria engage in lateral gene transfer, now there is the risk that the gene for this enzyme will spread from the bacteria that it's found in now to many other bacteria around the world. So there are some issues. So are we doomed? No. I don't think so. But I think it's remiss of us if we don't acknowledge that there are real challenges and think about how we can go about addressing those and what we need to do to maximize our odds of success against them. So one of the tools, not the only tool, is biology, bioscience. And one of the themes of the last few years has been that bioscience now is an information technology, which is a very good thing for us. Richard Dawkins famously was asked if he could sum up biology in one word, and he said digital. That was the one word he used. This is a modern sequencing workstation. It looks a lot like a computer because it really is a specialized electronic accessory and a computer. This is a sequencing center, so it looks a little bit like a data center. Craig Venter, I got a chance to chat with him a year ago or so, and one of the things that he said that stuck with me is that his #1 research tool is the computer. That's really what he and his team use more than anything else. Greg Stock showed you this exact same slide yesterday. This was in The Economist a month or two ago. While computing has come down in cost less than expected in the last decade, gene sequencing has come down in cost much more rapidly than expected. And so it's definitely on an exponential curve. And it goes back another 10 years before that in its exponential curve, at least. Since George Church, he's one of the fathers of genomics, he has a goal of sequencing 100,000 human genomes by 2020, but he's thinking too small because on this curve, we'll get down to $10 for human genome sequencing by 2020, and we should be able to sequence millions or tens of millions of people. But as Eliezer pointed out, tomatoes have genes too. There are genes in more than just humans. we know of about 1.5 million species on the planet, and we estimate there's 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, depending on who you ask. Let's say 3 million. We should be able to sequence all species on Earth for the cost of about $30 million. Maybe we want 100 samples of each species. That would be $3 billion. That's still not very much money. The reason this is interesting is because there are tools for us, because biology has evolved organisms that can do incredible things. And if we can understand how they do it, we can leverage that ourselves to enhance human health or to help adjust the biosphere to be able to survive some of the threats that it's under, mostly due to us. This is a graph of the 200 or so genomes we've got. We've learned interesting things in terms of overlap here. And I'll just say, dogs are an interesting case study. I think Greg may have mentioned this as well, that from wolves, in a few thousand generations, we've produced this incredible morphological diversity. Well, nature has more diversity. We know of organisms that can survive in the depths of the oceans. We know of organisms that can survive in the rims of volcanoes. We know of organisms that eat incredible doses of radiation for lunch. And so all of those are things that are potential tools for us that we can borrow from biology. Knowing is half the battle. If the genome is digital, can we edit it? Yes, mostly. This is the cover of The Economist. I resisted the urge to put Craig Venter's head on this figure, but this was talking about the work that he and his lab did on synthesizing a new organism, effectively, which really the technical feat there was being able to print out a sequence of 1.1 million base pairs to inject the genome they wanted into this organism. And that's also on a Moore's law curve. So within, 10, 15 years, we'll be able to create strands of DNA as long as the longest human chromosome, which is about 250 million base pairs, and we'll be able to effectively create whatever organisms we want, modulo the knowledge of what works with what. And indeed, nature has given us a number of tools for editing the genome. If the cell is a giant supercomputer, viruses are an input mechanism to get new data into that computer, if you will, along with many, many, many other tools. So what genes can we pick up from biology to do what? Well, let's start with energy. If we can crack energy, we can crack a lot of things. So for the last decade or so, there's been a lot of energy, a lot of hubbub, let's say, around biofuels. So you take some crop, you refine it, and you turn it into a fuel that you can use in your transportation fleet. The problem is that most biofuels right now just don't really work very well. The crops compete with food crops, which is part of why we had that food spike. The refining process is too expensive, and just the overall efficiency of turning solar energy into fuel is too low to make it really that worthwhile. So why is Craig Venter here talking about fuel? Because Exxon has paid, he and his company, $600 million to create designer organisms that will be more effective and more efficient in turning solar energy into fuel that we can use. In fact, what Venter says here is the ideal thing to do is not to just use cells that can do what we want, but to create, by direct design, organisms that do what we want in terms of turning that solar energy plus CO2 plus water into fuels that we can use. And in fact, here's a little visual of an algae-based biofuel factory, effectively, 3.5 billion years old. Photosynthesis creates sugars, and what Venter and synthetic genomics are doing is creating additional pathways that turn that into ethanol. Actually, there's dozens of companies in this field now. Into ethanol, into things that are more readily used in the fleet, even into hydrogen. So this is a potentially big deal in terms of being able to replace those finite stocks of oil. Here you can see hanging sheets of algae, just collecting sun in sort of a slightly more optimal configuration. This is an artist rendition of a proposed algae biofuel plant in the Nevada desert. One of the other nice things here is that they don't really compete with food crops. They use wastewater, both for water and nutrients in this situation. And DARPA now has gotten into the game. The US military has a mandate passed down from Congress that in the name of energy independence to be 50% running on biofuels by 2020. So DARPA actually has announced that by 2013, they believe they will be in large-scale production of biofuels for the ground fleet and for the air fleet at a cost below $5 per gallon, making it competitive. We'll see. It's an announcement, not yet a result, but that's very encouraging, and they're spending a lot of money on it. By the way, so a little plug. Part of why DARPA wants this is because they want to be able to create the fuels on site in the places that troops are deployed. The estimated cost per gallon of fuel in Afghanistan is $492. So almost anything that avoids the security and supply lines is a big advantage to them. This is the tobacco mosaic virus. I would have made you guess for 4 books, but I put it on the title. It's called the mosaic virus because it creates sort of regular geometric patterns on the leaves of tobacco plants. And what a group of researchers did just in the last few months is modify this virus to infect tobacco plants and create photovoltaic cells. So it creates, you see, this is a tiny scale. This is 100 nanometers, pardon me. So each of these cells is about 10 nanometers around. They're composed of several of these individual photoreceptive rods that take a photon, liberate an electron, and then release a lower energy photon. And so the idea, they don't have wires stuck into these tobacco plants, but the idea is that you can grind them up, process them, and have basically a spray-on photovoltaic coating that you can apply. Very early research, but biology is very promising in terms of low-cost manufacturing of a number of things. This is a GM eucalyptus tree from a company called Arborgen. This tree is frost-resistant. It grows at about twice the rate of other eucalyptus trees, and it has lower amounts of a protein called lignin, which make it less toxic and less energy intensive to turn into paper. So they are very close to approval for this. Obviously, there's a lot of backlash against GM trees, but it is something that would be very helpful in terms of making paper easier and cheaper to do, which would mean using less land and less disruption of existing forests. In addition, if we think about the balance of fossil fuels and CO2, this is slightly out of date, but humans pump maybe 6.5 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere right now. Plants actually uptake more than 100 billion tons of CO2. So if we could increase the photosynthetic capabilities of the whole planet by, say, 6%, 7%, it would be making up for all of the CO2 that we are pumping out. That's actually a very, very large task, but it is something that is not totally out of the question. This is possibly the first GMO animal food. This is a form of salmon called Aquadvantage salmon. It's also very close to approval, and its claim to fame is that on basically less food per gram delivered to you, and in about 2/3 of the time, it grows to maturity and a little bit larger. And given that fish stocks are collapsing, if we can more efficiently use the nutrients in the ocean and deliver this actually very healthy food to people, that's a big win. Okay, 4 books, if you can name what this is. This is an alien robot probe. No, this is a nanoassembler. No, this is a coccolithophore. So this is the most common calcifier in the oceans. It makes shells. It's single cellular itself, but it makes calcium shells. And it accounts for about 30% of all calcification in the oceans. Now, I told you that in aggregate, calcification is dropping due to CO2 going up in the oceans. And that's true. But this family of species, for some reason, actually do more calcification in high CO2 situations. So perhaps we can crack the genetic code of this species and understand what it is about them that allows them to be more efficient in utilizing CO2 and the resources available to produce more calcium and try to save other species that are being damaged by high CO2 if we can't deal with it in other ways. I think these things are just beautiful, by the way. Corals do regenerate, not very well. We help them in a lot of cases. The Maldives thought that they had suffered permanent damage to a lot of their corals, but have actually recently discovered that some subspecies of coral or some subcommunities are actually regrowing. We don't know why. Some of it's probably environmental and situational. Some of it may be genetic. So there's a lot that we can do there in just trying to understand what is the difference between those species that survive and thrive in warmer waters and so on versus those that fail, and see if we can spread those genes that help them adapt to the modern world. Spanish ibex is extinct. It was not extinct for about 7 minutes. Someone actually cloned a Spanish ibex, took some cells from the ear of the last living one, put it into a goat egg, and they had a live ibex born, which died 7 minutes later, sadly. We don't know if that was a complication of the cloning or not, but it certainly is evocative of could we bring back species that we are losing through that technology. Maybe not as far back as the woolly mammoth, but there are other things that are kind of more near and dear to us and more recently lost. I mentioned the SARS virus, but while we have pathogens kind of moving more quickly, we're moving more quickly as well. From the moment that the first SARS virus isolate was captured and shipped to a lab at about 1 a.m., I believe, 5 days later was when the fully available sequence was out there. Now, that sequence did not lead to a vaccine right away or anything like that, but we are picking up in agility. So in terms of surviving the pathogens around us or surviving bioterror attacks for that matter, I think that kind of a distributed network, which is what is being built now in biodefense, and these fast sequencing abilities are going to be vital to our survival. So fundamental limits, I'm going to have to go fast here as I'm slowly running out of time. The sun provides about 350 million terawatt hours of energy to the planet per year, which is vastly larger than the total amount of energy in all fossil fuel reserves. It's also about 1,000 times the amount of energy that human civilization uses each year. So we have tremendous, tremendous upside, tremendous abundance if we can learn how to tap into this. I'm not even going to go into nuclear or fusion or anything, but just with solar, there is a tremendous amount of potential upside. And efficiencies are rising. Here's my token non-biological slide. The peak efficiencies ever achieved in the lab now are about 40%. You have very cheap, easy to manufacture, large-scale techniques down here, and currently very expensive but very efficient techniques up here. And these will get cheaper. And I think Jose Cordero later today will talk a lot about solar energy and its prospects. If you can crack energy, you can crack a lot of things. We live on a water world. Fresh water is in short supply, but most of the water of the planet, 97.5%, is in the oceans. Even of the fresh water, most of that is either in Antarctica or in glaciers. And then the stuff that isn't there is just sort of moisture in the ground, if you will. Very, very little is available to humanity right now. So could we desalinate epic amounts of seawater? It takes about 0.77 kilowatt hours to desalinate 1 cubic meter of water. The average American uses 1,600 cubic meters of water per year. A cube 40 feet on a side is what you use directly and indirectly. If we assumed that 9 billion people on Earth were using as much water as Americans, it would take about 1/10 of the total world energy supply right now to desalinate that much seawater, or about 1/10,000th or maybe 1/50,000th of the amount of energy the sun strikes us with. Food supplies, I'll go fast. There are lots of things we can do. Photosynthesis is far from perfect. Most photosynthetic crops, most crops that we eat today, wheat, rice, and potatoes, are what they call C3 crops. They use a photosynthetic pathway that has 4.6% efficiency. Sugar cane and corn have 6% efficiency in their photosynthesis. So one of the questions open right now is, can you take C3 crops and genetically engineer them to be C4? There's a large consortium working on this with rice. Biochemists have calculated the peak efficiency that photosynthesis could achieve is about 13%. We don't know how to do that, but let's imagine that a mature bioscience could get us there. And in fact, this fantastic paper came out just a month ago, Increasing Photosynthetic Efficiency for Greater Yield, an annual review of plant biology. And these researchers lay out kind of a 30 to 40-year plan of about tripling photosynthesis in most food crops right now. And if you do the math, I won't walk you through it all, but you can get the slides. And you actually achieved kind of peak efficiency. I have to just discount this a number of times to make the numbers come out reasonable at all. You can feed, let's say, 300 billion humans on Earth if you had really mature biotechnology and really effective use of crops. I just divided that by 10 just to get it down to a reasonable number, and I got 30 billion. Now, the world's population looks to peak at about 9.5 billion. So what that means is that we could take 2/3 of the farmland that's available. Farmland is about 1/3 of all land, surface land on Earth, and turn it back into wilderness. Farming is the #1 cause of habitat destruction and species loss. Or turn it over to biofuel crops. Now, we're a long way from this technology, but this is kind of what the fundamental limits are about. Now, doom is not assured. and success is not assured. I am not a techno-volatilist in Eliezer's term, or whatever that term was. So I don't believe that we're going to head either for apocalypse or for utopia. But issues are real. There is no guarantee of success just because we've succeeded so far. So how do we maximize the odds that we head towards a wonderful future, which I think is actually what's most likely by far, and minimize the odds of devastation? This is Sumatra after an earthquake a few years ago. Even if the odds of devastation are only 1% or 1/10 of 1%, that warrants attention from us and sort of insurance against us. Well, to me, one of the key things we can do, not the only thing, one of the key things is making sure to optimize our rate of innovation, the technologies that matter. And in particular, this what's viable in the marketplace interests me, which is where's the money? Follow the money, if you will. And the money isn't really in science R&D. This is the discretionary budget of the federal government, not counting a whole lot of non-discretionary. And if you have a hard time finding science, it's because it's small. So science is maybe 2% of all funding. Energy funding, energy R&D funding was about $1.8 billion in 2007 versus defense R&D spending of about $78 billion. Fortunately, some of this trickles down. On the other hand, in the marketplace, U.S. Consumers and businesses spend $1 trillion on energy this year, which in $100 bills would fill this ballroom many, many times over. And they do this in this kind of peer-to-peer system, which to me, a marketplace, looks a lot like a neural network, a software technique that I've worked with a lot, biologically inspired, where nodes transmit information. It's not that small. It's like this times a million, perhaps. And the way that the market neural net works, if you will, is it takes in inputs in the form of supply of resources, demand for them, and computes prices and utilization. But there's a saying in computer science that garbage in, garbage out. And so we are sending in garbage inputs in many cases, garbage data, because the market perceives that there's an infinite supply of CO2 absorption capability in the atmosphere because there's no feedback. No one owns it. No one charges for it. It's unregulated. So you might as well just do as much as you can. It's a tragedy of the commons. Same for the oceans. Same for ocean fish. Same for freshwater aquifers. These things are kind of unowned, unpriced, and therefore perceived by selfish actors as infinite in supply. There's also distortions. U.S. energy subsidies to traditional fuels dwarf spending on everything else. So my thesis, as I'm being ushered off stage, is we have to clean up our inputs, clean up the model. We have to price or regulate these things to make ourselves smarter, to remove those distortions, invest not in consumption but in R&D, to incentivize taking care of the resources we have, incentivize innovation, and maximize the odds of success, minimize the odds of failure. Because one thing I definitely agree with Ray Kurzweil on is this century could be the century of mind, the century that liberates us from a lot of the travails that we have, but only if we take care of the resource we've been handed. Thank you very much.
Ramez, we are over into the break, but since I like the cut of your jib so damn much, I'm going to let you take one question. By the way, the guy I'm going to allow to ask a question is Jerry Orstrom, who wasn't here yesterday. He's the guy who gave us $10,000. So, big round of applause for him.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent talk. I've got a zillion questions, but I'm going to restrict them to a couple of question comments on climate change. I'm curious what your view is on the credibility of the climate models, whether they have any predictive value or if climate is simply too chaotic and unpredictable to be able to be measured by these models. By the way, your comment about prediction was from Yogi Berra, at least allegedly.
Thank you.
And two other comments, two of the graphs you put up. One of them looks suspiciously like Michael Mann's hockey stick graph, and I wonder if you'd care to comment on Ross McKittrick's alleged debunking of the so-called hockey stick. The other graph of the 400,000 year correlation between warming and CO2. Climate change skeptics have argued that that correlation is actually one where the warming precedes the elevated levels of CO2.
Yep.
So cause and effect is not necessarily clear, according to them, if you'd care to comment on that. And later I'd like to talk to you about fisheries depletion, which is a severe problem, and there is a known solution which has worked.
May I please remind all Jerrys to not dialogue with the speakers?
Fabulous questions. I'll try to go fast. Climate models, invariably, like undoubtedly, there are a number of things to improve. But the very most basic physics of are we trapping more heat in the atmosphere, in the biosphere, due to increased presence of water vapor, CO2, methane, and so on in the atmosphere? Yes. I mean, if you reduce the models to the simplest they can get, remove all the bells and whistles, they predict warming. And then there's a lot of questions about how fast the warming will happen. One at a time, please. The second question was about Michael Mann. I don't think it's really been successfully debunked. And then in terms of has the warming preceded CO2, sometimes it has, actually. But I think that's best explained by the fact that there is a feedback loop between the warming and CO2. So when the planet does warm, it releases more CO2 that has been locked up. But when CO2 levels rise, that also causes the planet to warm by trapping more heat in the system.
Thank you, Ramez. Ramez Naam, everyone.